not only do I love it, but I also find very romantic and moving the idea that this is a thing that human beings made, and a very artistic thing that human beings made, that can never exist again.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We cover the big invisible forces that have us all in their grasp. And typically I do really high-minded conversations. If you've been tuning in, you know we talk to politicians and peace negotiators and psychologists and sociologists. But sometimes, you guys, I just want to hang out with my friends. And that, as the host of this podcast, is my privilege. And so I brought on this week a old friend and colleague, Adam Rogers, who has been a journalist like me. I would argue he's smarter and better journalist than I am. He's a very thoughtful guy. He's written 2 books where I've only written 1. He's just a very hardworking and intelligent human. And he is great at weaving stories that are, I would argue, almost kind of like, he's someone who knows a lot about science and technology, but he really cares about the fantasy and magic and science fiction of life. And there's something for me about the conversation that we have here about, ostensibly we're talking about booze and the role it plays in society, the role it increasingly doesn't play in young people's lives, and what that sort of, what that means. But we're also talking here about a sort of like connecting to history, connecting to the larger things of life, conquering chaos and toasting absence. And there's some bigger themes here that I think are really beautiful. Anyway, it's a conversation that I have really enjoyed, but he's a good friend. And so, is it my privilege to just sort of bring a guy like that in? Sure, absolutely. But I think you'll enjoy this conversation, hour-long conversation. I hope you enjoy it with Adam Rogers. You had me you were very hospitable in inviting me and my family to Passover Seder. I'm not Jewish, but I always feel very blessed when I get to join a Jewish tradition. In your case, you stood not far, in fact, I would say exactly where you are currently sitting,
just
and gave
right
a very beautiful talk, a riff about, I'm going to say booze, but that wasn't really what it is. You wrote this book, Proof, that I can see over your shoulder there. This is a specialty of yours, but I thought you sort of weaved it into something very beautiful. And I wondered if you just want to, you don't have to do the exact same thing, but for everyone's benefit, just because I think everybody should enjoy it, not to embarrass you, but riff on that for me for a second. Let's do a reprise of your Seder tribute, please.
Well, I always worry about this because the riffs at my Seders are as a tradition in my family, calling them off the cuff is almost an insult to cuffs. They really.
Plus, your family interrupts you endlessly,
at every
which is
moment.
funny. There's a lot of heckling. I noticed.
I've made sure to train my 2 children to carry on with the tradition that I did with my father and that he did with the folks that we used to go to Seders with too. But part of just to justify that beyond me being a total smartass and my children as well, part of Judaism as a tradition. And I'm not very religious at all. I'm loosely culturally Jewish. Both my parents are Jewish. My dad was a bar mitzvah. I'm not. But part of that tradition is it not only allows for but demands critique from the outside. The ideas have to withstand that critique. Part of the way that you test the ideas is by talking about them, by arguing the points. Famously, there's a whole set of other Jewish holy books that are just people arguing about the first holy books and what they mean. What does it mean that there's a comma there? Maimonides says that the comma means you're supposed to pause, and Rabbi Ben Eliezer says the comma means you're supposed to reflect, and are those 2 things that that kind of stuff. So
it's very scientific method, right? It's very cool. It's sharpening your thoughts all the time.
And the reason for it, one of the reasons that Jews do it that way is that long about the year 70 Common Era or so, the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and that was the equivalent for the Jews of what it would be for Catholics if you destroyed the Vatican. It was a guillotine strike, killed the priest class, leaving only the people in charge of the remote temples, the rabbis, the teachers. So it in some senses forced Jews to figure out their personal relationship with Scripture, with the text, and with God. And to some extent, those things are inextricable from one another. God wrote the Torah, created the universe by writing the Torah. It was a literary act in many respects. I'm saying all this as somebody who's really not that religious, so take all this with both kosher salt and salt with iodine.
Right. Sure.
but the way that plays out in my house, as it always did, at Seder's, was to try to struggle with the material, try to understand what you're doing at that meal that night, celebrating the kind of freedoms that you're supposed to celebrate. In my very political family, that was very important. And
because you grew up, just so people are aware, like you grew up, like your family goes way back in like labor activism. Is it right to say communism? Right, you go way back to. You guys put what we consider lefty today strikes me as inaccurate in
would be very centrist. Yes, my family.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of that argument in the Monty Python movie Life of Brian, People's Liberation Front of Judea, we're Judean Liberation People's Front. That thing. That's my family. My family's been organizing. My great grandfather organized unions in the 1920s for the communists, which was fine at the time. Like there hadn't been a Red Scare yet. That was just another kind of politics. My grandmother organized in the 50s. And my parents were union folks. They were school teachers in LA, and they both did that too. And so yeah, I'm I guess what you would call a red diaper baby. Usually that was a term for the generation before me. Like my mom really was, because her mother was underground for a period of time as a person who was kind of blacklisted and chased by the FBI. So I'm like a red diaper grand baby, I guess. And when I wrote the booze book, part of what entranced me about the idea of both fermentation, this thing that you do to make wine or beer, where you take a source of sugar like a grape or a grain, let it ferment, and then you drink that, is that that's a natural process that happens without humans. Grapes will ferment on a vine without people being around because there's yeast in the world. But the next step that we take with some stuff that we drink, if we're drinkers, if we consume alcohol, is distillation. And that's a chemical process, not just a biochemical process, but a chemical one and a technological one. In order to distill, to get to the essence of something, you need metallurgy, you need woodworking, you need an understanding of how molecules separate from one another, even if it's a rudimentary understanding. This is all stuff that doesn't really happen for humans until about 2,000 years ago, give or take. But it becomes central to ceremony and religion and culture, and becomes part of the way that we understand our place in nature. This place where we not only partake of stuff that nature does, whether we're there to do it or not, but we're technological animals. We make stuff, we transform things. Other animals do that a little bit, but not to the extent that we do. Right. And that's historic. That puts us in a different stature on Earth than other critters. So, why talk about that at Passover? Well, so much of human ceremony is centered around psychoactive substances like alcohol. And Passover is no different. Traditionally you're supposed to drink 4 glasses of wine.
What's funny is I've been to lots of Passovers. I don't think I really understood that until I went to yours. People hit it hard. That was awesome.
Yeah.
So hard. You had an uncle who choked for a second and accidentally blew half of his glass of red wine onto the dude sitting across from him, the nice man sitting across the table. This was a much more eventful Passover than I'm used to, and drinkier, which was awesome.
It was a pretty drinky. But keep going. It's a pretty drinky holiday. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, you even put a glass of wine out for the prophet Elijah at Passover. Like even it's like, sure.
Everybody drinks.
Yeah. You can put out milk and cookies for Santa if you want, but Elijah's here to, and he's stopping at everybody's house too. So that guy's blitzed by the end of the Seder.
That's right.
That also there's a that's probably not that healthy for people, I suppose, but it's part of a communal spirit. And you were there, and you typically don't drink much alcohol.
I don't drink. Yeah, that's right.
But I hope you still felt engaged with the proceedings. With the
my problem is my deep enthusiasm for alcohol. It's not a lack of interest or enthusiasm, which is why I've always found your scholarship on this stuff so interesting, because my instinct, because we inevitably are biased towards our own predilections, is my scholarship goes toward addiction. Scholarship is not the right word, but my storytelling and investigative stuff goes toward addiction and capitalism and big alcohol and how they work and blah 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 blah. I'm taking all the fun out of it because I've taken the fun out of it the fun out of my life. You, however, I think have a much sort of, first of all, you have a healthier relationship to it in that you don't you found balance in a way that I was not able to, and I keep interrupting you here, but that was sort of the thing. You find meaning in it in a way that I was very inspired by.
I don't know if that's
for you talk about it as it's a mark of civilization.
Yeah.
And there's also a certain kind of, I think the word you used in your Seder, I don't mean to cut into your punchline here, was alchemy. Yeah. There's a real alchemy to how we as humans have come to a place of making booze. And then that carried in the conversation or the riff that you were doing, into this broader transmuting of pain and difficulty and so forth into beneficial, productive, loving community. I don't know. There was something very powerful about that, which for me, as a guy who doesn't drink anymore, I don't engage with that thinking about booze very much anymore, and I found it very moving, and in a way that I was okay with.
I'm glad of that, because one of the things that we've really tried to learn in my house, and you see this same kind of very good bars are trying to learn this as well, is that you want to have the same kind of conviviality and coming together around a meal for everybody, even people who don't want to consume alcohol for a bunch of different reasons. And you just laid out a bunch of them. Addiction issues are certainly one of them. There's a very good capitalist argument for not anti-capitalist argument for not drinking, right? Because it's very much it's an industry very much dominated, even with microbreweries and microdistilleries and stuff. It's very much dominated by large transnational companies. You could decide, screw that, I don't want a piece of that. It's another one of those things that was like everybody did that in their backyards, and then systematically over the last few thousand years has turned into a big transnational corporate thing.
Well, and I think not to suck all the fun out of it, but people don't, I think, realize too that except for a pretty intense piece of federal legislation, we would actually be drinking a lot more than we do. And that's because you're no longer allowed, as you were prior to Prohibition, to be the owner, brewer, distributor, and retailer of booze. You have to have, those roles have to be separated out, so that people who truck it to the restaurants have to be a separate company from the people that distill it. Once upon a time, Anheuser-Busch could just own the bar and the entire monopoly and would charge you more or less nothing for beer, which is to keep you coming back, which is why cirrhosis of the liver was the number one killer of men in the couple decades prior to Prohibition. We just still so that conviviality that you're talking about, I think it's such a cool thing, but it's also held in this regulatory, it's made possible by regulation in a way that I think is really a nice thing.
There's as in so much, there's a system behind what we think is just us wandering into a bar to get a beer or something. But I will say that the structure of laws you described is in the United States. Many states have done a lot of work to break that tripartite monopoly, because here in the Bay Area, for example, local distilleries are allowed to both make and sell. And there's a bunch of rules that they have to follow, and it's confusing. But my favorite small distillery in the country is here in Alameda, called St. George Spirits, and it's a little company. They distribute around the world now, but that's a small local company that wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that if they had been subject to the strict rules that kind of came about because there was so much drinking.
Right, because there was
in the
so
United
much
States,
that
there's
we
so
had to pull back to the place of conviviality and magic that you have talked about.
And even more than that, people were drinking beer certainly in England and Europe because the water wasn't safe and because laborers were getting a ton of their calories from it. So people who were doing work, like Industrial Revolution kind of work, like building railroad kind of work, were getting a significant percentage of just their daily calories that they needed, that they were being forced to need
Wow.
to do this work.
I assume that
from beer.
predates child labor laws too, right? So I assume kids are out there working and probably getting some calories that way.
Yeah, this is teens and 20s. This is Industrial Revolution, late 18s into the early part of the 20th century.
Wow.
It was one of the reasons, again, the teetotaling movement that led to prohibition was, as in so many things that you dig into in American history, also primarily a racist thing. And there was a lot of fears of drunk black and brown people.
Oh, no kidding. I didn't know that at all. Is that
Yeah,
right?
very much so.
Wow.
But also, a lot of people were just drunk all the time.
Yeah, right.
For the reasons that we just laid out, because they were getting their calories that way, the water wasn't safe, and it was just it was
Life is
plentiful
hard.
and it was crummy. Yeah, and life was hard.
Yeah,
exactly.
Life is hard. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So for you, do you, this is me using the podcast as an excuse to hang out with you just because I like to hear you talk. So we're going to go wherever really we want to here. But I, one of the things that I sort of wanted to bring you in for, and because I think you've done such a good job with, like, you take these what could be very specifically technical topics, alcohol, color, right? These very broad and things that people could really, you could see people in the modern world sort of engaging in these topics totally on the technical basis of them. Here's the chemistry, here's the, how the visual cortex works, blah, 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 blah. But one of the reasons that you and I have been friends for as long as we have, I think, is that you really believe in there's some magic around the narrative that you get out of these subjects that I wonder if you could just sort of like talk to me about for a second, because it feels to me like you like the technical stuff. You'll nerd out like as hard as anybody on the technical stuff. You once explained to me on and on about how yeast, we barely understand how it works, but it creates all these amazing effects. And like you can geek out hard, but you also believe in the sort of, I wonder how do you think about that balance in your life between the sort of the magic of this stuff and the science of this stuff?
Believe it or not, I've actually been reading a lot of the history of the occult and magic for the last few years. Partially,
the wall behind you is full of science fiction and fantasy,
and then there's the science fiction.
You consume huge amounts of that. That's right.
I do. So yes, I mean, obviously, I love the sort of technical details, as you say. I really do want to know how stuff works, and I have a brain only strong enough to know how it works to the level of a good reporter.
Yeah, sure.
Become a scientist.
Welcome, brother. Yeah, that's right on.
And in part, that's because I want to learn about a whole bunch of stuff that's not connected, and so I don't get the PhD in all of it, sadly. But I also, like you, I share I share with you a desire to understand how people know stuff, not just what people know. And I do think that trying to understand science, or in kind of pre-scientific human history, trying to understand how the universe worked through magic and through the occult and things like predicting the future with astrology and stuff like that, we would say from the perspective of 2025 that none of that worked, right, in scare quotes. It didn't really explain how the world worked, and it didn't let you act on the world or transform the world in a way that you might want to. But it gave you kind of a framework, at least a linguistic framework, for understanding the world around you. And similarly, science, like we use science to actually understand stuff, to like, oh, I know how, I have a framework for understanding subatomic particles in physics that doesn't really have much of a bearing on your life or mine, except insofar as it helps electricity work or helps you understand relativity or something.
And it is a matter of faith in a way. You just accept that these things you will never observe directly, that the texts tell you are there, are the basic the fundamentals of the universe.
But you can like you and I could do a lot of the experiments.
I guess that's right.
That taught you, that taught people, like, oh, that is how, subatomic particles are both, they act like a wave and they act like a particle at the same time. Like you and I could set up that experiment
Yeah.
if we wanted to. And that would tell us something more direct than trying to use a 13-year-old boy who's a little bit stoned staring at painting on his fingernails to look into a scrying pool and predict the future, which was like an approach to understanding how to predict the future.
Right.
But what I like about all of that stuff is trying to figure out how do we know what's true? How do we know how the universe works? How can I begin to understand that in a lot of different fields? And so, as both a journalist and somebody who trained a little bit in science and then covered science for all of my career, the place that those two things overlap is, how do I know what's right? How do I know if I'm right or not? How do I figure out if I'm wrong? And, what's a way to engage with things that I like more than just, I get a dopamine hit from that. Mm-hmm. So with the booze stuff especially, I mean, this really was for me what did it, and it's what led over years directly to the booze book, was going into a bar and being like, I want to know what's in those bottles behind the bar. Those are cool. Look at all those different shaped bottles and they're all different colors. Wait, why are they those colors? How come they come in those different bottles? Why does this one taste like that and this one tastes like that other thing? And so there's a way to engage with connoisseurship in that sense. I'm not saying like I'm a sommelier or something. I'm not. But like my way of engaging with the like, I like that whiskey more than I like that other whiskey. Well, why? What's in that? They're made the same way. Why are they different?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And as soon as that happens for me, I'm like, well, I'm going to have to go get some books,
When we come back, we're going to keep going down this vein of the magic and science of booze with Adam Rogers. Stay with us. I remember interviewing one of the architects of the first decriminalization of marijuana, who was a regulator in Washington State when they were first writing their rules about it. I think they were actually following Colorado, whatever. Anyway, she expressed disappointment at the time that she couldn't do Amsterdam-style cafes because they had pulled really badly. People associated the idea of a marijuana bar with violence and driving and all of this sort of like bad behavior. And she said, it's a real tragedy for public health. And I was like, what do you mean? What's the public health benefit of a weed cafe? Huh. And she said, well, what you need is a place where you can agree through social pressure on how stoned is too stoned. If you're too stoned to talk to a girl and you embarrass yourself, you will know not to do that in future. It imposes some moderation, as opposed to just going home and being on your Xbox all night, where getting as high as you possibly can carries no social punishment. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all. And you have always been, for me, you have, I would love to know, like, first of all, like, what's a great bar? What's a bar you love? Because you've been to them all over the world. I know for the book you got to do that. And I get to sort of experience bars vicariously through you. And what is it about a great bar? And do you agree with this thesis of it imposing some order on life as opposed to its reputation?
Yeah, well, I want to go in reverse order because one of the great things about science is that you can apply multiple frameworks to the same set of data and get different understanding out of it. So
sure,
it's absolutely true that you can think about a bar as a sociological and psychological locus. And in fact, there are some great labs in the U.S. and elsewhere where researchers, primarily sociologists, basically build a bar and then serve drinks or not drinks to people and then study their interactions and how they work. And the reason they do, and to do this, you come up with a drink where you can't tell if there's alcohol in it or not. It's essentially a highly citrus flavored vodka tonic, basically.
Right. So they're super sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you can't tell. So really like even a booze person such as myself would not be able to tell whether you just served me a vodka tonic or a tonic, And then you're like, okay, well, so what's driving behaviors in those bars? Is it the drug, the psychoactive compound, alcohol? Or is it the expectancies, the psychological environment, the theater?
Right.
And you can find elements of both. And I bring that up because if you want to use neurochemistry instead of sociology, you'd like to understand, well, what does alcohol actually do in the brain? What does it do to people? And the weird thing about alcohol is that unlike almost every other psychoactive compound that human beings consume, people don't really know how alcohol works in there. So like marijuana, cannabinoids, benzodiazepines, I don't know, caffeine,
Right.
pick your poison, as they say. Researchers can find receptors in the brain that these things lock into and have certain kinds of effects. Alcohol, it seems like it's the same system that benzodiazepines, like clonazepam or Valium, like that those affect, which is why they have a synergistic effect. You're not supposed to drink and take those at the same time because having one and one isn't just having two, it's more. But people don't really understand. And
I didn't know that. I would have assumed that there was enormous scientific understanding of those effects.
Super weird. And one of the reasons there isn't is that same, the thing we started talking about at the top, which is what gets studied with alcohol very reasonably is addiction and its effects on the GI tract and the liver, stuff like that. The bad stuff that comes out because people drink a lot, they get sick. Makes total sense. But there's been very little research, even though it's illegal. It's been legal in the United States since the end of Prohibition, 28 or whenever that was. There's been very little research on like, well, why does it make you feel good? Because we don't do a lot of research on why stuff makes people feel good. Neurochemically, we're just not like that. But one of the things that does seem true about alcohol is that unlike a lot of these other drugs, it's one of the few that the one reliably predictable effect of it is that it makes people violent.
Oh, wow.
People really do get angry and violent on this stuff in a way that they do not with marijuana.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And when we talk about violent behavior associated with illicit drugs, what we're usually talking about is behavior associated with the market, with the illicit marketplace, the illegal marketplace.
Right. The killing of competitors, the cartel violence, that kind of thing.
Or the committing of petty crimes or more than petty crimes
to
to
fund
get money
your habit
to fund
or
a habit.
whatever. Right. I see.
Right. But not so with an Amsterdam structure. Even in the places where marijuana is legal in the United States, I think there's some crime of like burglarizing the pharmacies.
That's right, because the stores all deal in cash, and as a
they're
result,
unbanked
are
because of
a great target for their unbanked. That's right. That's right. But it's not a locus of violence because of the chemistry of the thing or its effect on the brain. That's interesting. But it is so the reputation that bars have for being a place of violence is not inaccurate.
Not unfounded. Although different cultures have different expectancies around behavior with alcohol, and some cultures are less violent, it turns out, than others. Some cultures, alcohol is a thing to only be consumed with other people. Some cultures, it's a thing that you only consume alone. Some cultures, it's a thing that only men consume when they're together with men. Some cultures, it's a thing that people consume when it's men and women together. Potential romantic partners. I don't mean to be heteronormative about that, but you know what I'm saying.
Right.
But so that does vary across cultures. But also that research isn't great either because it's anthropology. That's always often conducted with its own expectancies built in how anthropology is conducted around the world. So the anthropology on how like indigenous cultures respond to alcohol sometimes is fraught with all those sorts of racialized assumptions, even racist assumptions are made. So it's hard to read that, but that's out there. There's a couple of famous books.
So in your travels, in researching the book and looking at all the different places that people consume alcohol, do you prefer the sort of, obscure Japanese whiskey's dark bar that only the adults are in? Do you like the model, the UK, right? It's like a family place. You go with you bring your kids after church for, a meat pie and a pint and you're reading the paper and the kids are running around, right? It's a whole other cultural environment. Like which one what do you gravitate towards when you think about bars?
I contain multitudes.
Well, sure.
No, sure. I mean, to be honest, it is true that my favorite kind of bar is the Japanese listening bar one, the dark, probably too fancy for most. Like I'm not a dive bar person. I'm not a karaoke person. I'm a person who likes to go and I like to go and, I sound like a schmuck saying this.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I had a dive bar phase. I enjoyed that when I was a bartender for a time. And I would get off my shift and you go to the the last place that's open.
Right.
And that's always a sort of a divey spot, but you know your thing, and you get a shot and a beer because you're trying to move fast, and there's a whole chemistry to that, choreography to the dive bar that I got into. But I'm like you, the dark expensive bars speak to me. There's the one in Grand Central Station, the former living room of what's his name, of Rockefeller, whoever it was.
The apartment.
The apartment.
Right,
that's right. That's a great one.
Room,
yeah, that kind of thing. Or there was in New York City, they're mostly New York City bars because that's where most of my drinking was. There was a fantastic bar called Angel's Share.
Angel's Share was the one that I was going to go.
Yeah, were you? Oh man, that's the one. That's the one. So for people who've never been there, you go up through a restaurant, an izakaya that's there, that's very loud and bright and moving fast. You make a U-turn, and you would never know that through this door that could be to the restroom, you don't know, is a whole other bar, this big, beautiful, dark bar. And it was the most beautiful place because there was all these rules.
Yep.
Only 4 people. You could not show up with a party of 5. No standing at the bar.
Nope.
So you couldn't stand at the bar.
Yeah,
if it's full, it's full. You got to wait outside. And no phones. They were very early on the no phones rule. And you couldn't be very loud. So you weren't even really allowed to do that. And then in exchange, you got the most beautifully made things where they were chipping the big block of ice from a big block of ice. And, everything's just gorgeous, like down to the peanuts. That experience was beautiful. And yeah, I love a bougie bar. I'm there.
So Angel's Share was part of what at the time was a cluster of Japanese businesses on that
Yeah, dude,
corner.
they're all gone.
They're all gone.
now.
It was one guy who essentially started or helped start all of them. It also had a beautiful mural over the bar looking down.
Yes.
A
a downcast Asian cherub.
That's right.
Being tortured by the laughter of white cherubs around him. So cool.
Seems understandable.
Fuck yeah. I was like, yeah, I feel you, sir.
In the pre-internet days, the way you found Angel's Share was if you were walking on 9th Street, you would look up and go, those are really big windows up there. What are those?
Yeah.
And you go, I think that's a bar. And you walk in, stupid gaijin walking into this actually very good Japanese restaurant. The restaurant in front of it was really great.
Yeah, the izakaya is fantastic. I would eat there too. That's right. But a very different vibe. For me, the thing that was also so fantastic about Angel's Share is that it was one of the only places in New York City where you could be up a story. You could go upstairs and look down on the street from one story up. And it was on a bias. So and I used to live Lower East Side. I would walk to Astor Place where I worked. So I'd spend, 4 or 5 months at a time only navigating that grid. And the grid gets to me. The grid in New York really starts to drive me crazy. And so for me, being allowed to break the grid and sit against that window on a diagonal above the street and look down was as close to getting to go to a park or look at the ocean as I sort of got in that phase of my life.
In the grand Vonnegut novel that we all live in, I'm confident that you and I once certainly narrowly avoided elbowing each other on the street in front of Angel's Share.
Oh yeah.
So Angel's Share doesn't exist there anymore. It closed a few years ago. They've reopened. There's another. It's now in the West Village. There's an Angel's Share. I went there about 2 years ago when I was back in New York. Last time I was in New York and went. And it's now steps down, so you don't have the big window, but it's still being back in an Angel's Share was really
that's cool though. That's cool. That's great.
So the thing that you're talking about though that I do like, and so I do love the theater of a bar.
Yeah,
different kinds of bars have different kinds of theater, and there's a thing that the booze book opens with me talking about, in every bar, it's always about 6:30 p.m. It's always dark. It's that's
evening's ahead of you. Anything's possible.
Time and space are being controlled for in a very theatrical way. That bar functions like a proscenium for a bartender. The thing that I always wanted, and this even predated being interested in drinking really, but to be able to be in different kinds of bars and know the etiquette for all of them and be able to understand where I was and function in the theater, because it's immersive theater. You play a part. You play a part.
You have
a
role. That's right.
And so knowing that in this kind of bar, I can order this kind of drink and it will be good and it will be received well, that I will be ordering that and I will have a fun interaction with a bartender. And this is a bar where you get a Wild Turkey Rocks.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a bar where you
vodka
specify.
Soda. This is a vodka soda spot. And this spot, reach a little bit. You can
That's right.
take his recommendations. That's right.
So when we were in New York, the other bar that we used to go to, my wife and I used to sit in the front room at Gramercy Tavern,
Yeah.
which had a beautiful front room, and you could get, the food was great, and it was when we, had money for the first time, and so we could spend
Sure.
it on Saturday.
Right.
But
right. And no future ambitions, really.
that's right. We're there to spend it all.
Yeah. That's right.
And it was also, because of the bartenders behind the bar, it was a teaching bar. It was a place where if you walked in there, as we did, with an open heart and an open liver,
Right.
you could be like, well, what's in that bottle? And the bartender would be like, well, let me pour you a taste of that, but actually let me pour you a taste of these other two things because they're even weirder. Like the even weirder even weirder always gets me. That's like any bartender, or indeed any salesperson of any sort of thing, if they figure out early on that the words even weirder unlock my credit cards, those are the places they're like, oh, I got something weirder than that.
You are powerless to resist those people. That's fantastic.
Works in bookstores, works in bars.
When we come back, I want to ask about the weirdest booze you own, because I know you have a very odd collection of all this stuff. So think about it for a second and stay with us. So you have a personal collection of this stuff that I have seen, and you're always very hospitable with people about it. I always feel terrible that I can't partake. Do you like what's weird in your collection? What's an unlikely thing you enjoy, something that somebody else might not have tasted before?
I will say the exigencies of both my aging gastrointestinal tract and my aging bank accounts both mean that the collection's a lot weirder than it has been in years past. Because there have been times when, and part of what I always like at Passover too, this has been true since my wife and I started doing Seder's when we were kids in New York, was like when people would start to leave, but like our friends knew you will stay because the weird, the weird.
Yeah, he'll break out the weird stuff if we stick around.
Just stay.
Yeah, right.
So like, I still have a couple of bottles of a few years ago. There's a whiskey called Imperial Single Malt Scotch that the distillery is closed and has been razed. It doesn't exist anymore. And it's delicious. And I had the first time I went to Scotland when I was in my 20s to go to distilleries. I had it then, and distillery's gone. Every so often, for the past few years, 20 or so, an independent bottler would come up with a barrel and would bottle it under their own label. Say this is Imperial, but from it, because that's one of the things that happens in whiskey. But not only do I love it, but I also find very romantic and moving the idea that this is a thing that human beings made, and a very artistic thing that human beings made that can never exist again. It just, because of the way a whiskey distillery works, the shape of the still is very important to the flavor, the place that they age the whiskey is important, where they get the
no one will be able to
barley.
Recreate these same conditions.
Can't be done. And even if you had a good lab and you could get all the chemicals together, if you do gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy on whiskey, there's molecules in there that nobody's ever characterized, so nobody really knows what they are. You can't reassemble it. You couldn't use nanotechnology, to make it again. You can't use artificial flavors. It just can't be done. So
I love that. You're drinking loss. You're drinking absence.
It's the end,
some way.
the end stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't drink it a lot because drink stuff a lot. But I'm not trying to save it. Like the point is, I want to drink it. Like, but every time I do, I think like, wow, this is a connection to absence, and to human industry and to human art. We make things that'll disappear.
Right. The comfort, being comfortable with that sort of temporary status, all of our temporary status. That's nice. Yeah, like I say, I just think that there's something, the way you engage with the subject is just very interesting to me because it is not, you're not snooty about it. You don't drop names in a sort of, you haven't had that? Well, geez, you really, but you also aren't just a drinker. You're not a lush. Like you're not somebody who is pulled to this. I have a friend. I have a friend who's a very very high functioning alcoholic. He's he's really amazing at it. And you've never heard a guy describe something with greater pleasure than this man describes getting a beer from the vending machines in the Narita airport in Tokyo.
Well, that is pretty great.
He's like, it's so cold it burns your fingers. It's crazy, you know. But he's pulled to it by his dependents, I would say.
Well, look at all the different ways that you can tell this story. That's one of the things I love about it. Like, I can tell you I can tell you the narrative of Imperial as a distillery. That's a historical, romantic narrative of loss and tragedy, but also the wonder of this thing that they make. I can tell you the chemistry story. I can tell you how distilling works technically. You know, I can talk you through barley and yeast and fermentation and distillation and aging, and I can tell you the neurochemical story roughly. I mean, but I can tell you I can tell you how alcohol works. I can even tell you a smell and taste story. How do we perceive the different flavors and how when they're dissolved in an alcohol versus if they were dissolved in water, why that would be different. How we perceive alcohol when we just as a experience in our nose and our mouth. All those things are true about whiskey or about booze. They're all science stories, you know, to me in a lot of ways. Maybe not the narrative one, but still there's some science of that. There are different ways of engaging with this stuff that I think are positive ways because there are some dangerous ways to engage with it too. As you say, it's an addictive substance and it causes a lot of heartache for people and pain and genuine violence and suffering and death. I tried to say with my book about it that the book takes place about 2 sips into your second drink.
Right. The good place. You're in the good place with booze consumption. That's right. Well, and this is what I also appreciate about the way you discuss it, is you don't shy away from the fact that it has, you know, that the data shows it is connected to violence. Like, you're not an apologist for booze. You're an enthusiast for when it does things nice, but you know what it is to be 2 sips into your second drink as opposed to that last regretful drink, the drink you regret, which is, it's impossible to know which one that one's going to be.
That's right.
Right. But there's a balance to how you think about it that feels to me very journalistic. It's very, you're very even keeled about it in a way that is not often true. I worked for but for a few years, right around September 11th, which was a weird time to be doing this subject, but in architecture and design magazines. And there was always this split between people who, on the staff, who were like, you know, academic level enthusiasts, loved it as a discipline that, you know, it was criticism. They were all critics. They want to talk about volume and plane and the cross section and the plan. You know, they're rendering judgment. And in tech, we've experienced this too, where you're sort of, you know, there's people who want to critique the ups and downs of a company because they're enthusiastic about the leadership. There's a sort of, it's like sports. Yeah. It's like sports reporters, you know, something like that. Whereas I fell much more into this other category that I think you would have fit right into if you were on this staff, where I thought of design as interesting because it told us a story about ourselves. And through the design of how, like, you know, I discovered at one point during that magazine period that prisons and schools in the United States are very often designed by the same architects. There's couple of industrial practices that do the same thing, and the same premises are brought to school. And so you learn everything you need to know about a culture through that kind of thing, you know. And that feels to me like your approach here. You're telling these stories, but you're getting at what it's trying to tell us about ourselves in some way, it feels to me.
I have a little bit of pragmatism about this as well. I do enjoy, though I am not skilled at it, sommelier level critique of a glass of wine, let's say. Or
you can get down, if you were to be with some folks who really like a snifter, you could deal with that.
Yeah, I don't really have the. I'm not great at it, and part of the reason is that in order to be genuinely great at it, you have to have the vocabulary. It's very closely. It's a linguistic skill as much as it is a sensory one and a practiced one. But I can do it a little bit, and my palate's okay. So like I can get in. Like I've done professional tasting once or twice, and I've done it. It's really fun until it's like it's a lot of booze. It really knocked me on my ass.
That's right.
But like I can do that. I like that connoisseurship, that kind of critique of architecture too. I like looking at a building and be like, oh, I see what they've done with the
It's a
the
way of
shafts are in the
seeing.
ground.
You learn a way of seeing that
is.
I appreciate. I was not very good at it either, which is probably why I was a little snooty about it. But I appreciate that. That's right.
But I also, in the last few years, I've become very interested in housing and because I like how cities function, and that seems to me to be very important. They're trying to find ways to make sure that we're building enough homes for people. Living as I do in a neighborhood which has a lot of my neighbors are unhoused, and just for being in California where that's a major issue for a lot of different reasons. And I've changed some of my thinking about. I used to think about like the classic Soviet bloc housing, as being like, well, that's really, gosh, so the brutalist kind of that. And now I look at that stuff, I'm like, well, houses, love it.
That's right.
Nice for people to live.
Right.
Love it. Seems great.
Yeah, the original Le Corbusier stuff, right, was all, City of a Million People was supposed to be a big tower block, set among the pastoral landscape so that you wouldn't ruin the fields.
Yep.
And everybody lives in that one tower, and then you all get to enjoy the nature all around you. But as an American, you look at that now, Tom Wolfe wrote a whole book called From Bauhaus to Our House that makes the point that became housing projects. That became big, scary stuff that way. That's right. But you're seeing it in this way that feels to me like you're getting meaning out of it beyond just the sort of aesthetic enthusiasm for it.
That's right.
Which I dig.
And I think, when if I think you were going to you asked me about my favorite bar before, but if I think about like my favorite drinks, like any time, like if I can think of one, like, oh man, that one drink was really super special, at least some of them are on the order of, it was a jar of sake I bought from a vending machine before getting on a Shinkansen, to sit on a train and eat a bento box and drink really commodity level sake, like a Budweiser equivalent of sake, but in that environment, in that moment, perfect. A perfect drink.
I love that.
Can't
I love
be
that. When we come back, I want to talk about the fading enthusiasm for alcohol among young people, and how I think it also happens to coincide with a fading enthusiasm for the kind of storytelling magic that we've been talking about this hour. We're going to get into that. Stay with us. I've been looking at these, data points about how young people are not drinking anywhere near as much as our generation did, and And I think it's very interesting to me the way in which, like, on the one hand, I think awesome, because as a recovering drinker, I know that there's a lot of health benefits to not drinking. I was really hoping when I quit drinking that it was going to have no impact on my life so that I could go right back to it. It turned out to be a transformative thing, and that was very hard. I was like, fuck. Yeah, I know, exactly. Fuck. But so that's one way I interpret that data point. On the other hand, I also look at the loneliness of young people, which is an epidemic right now. And, I'm sure you've had the experience, as I have, in sort of social circles around the tech industry. You go to a dinner party, or, I go sometimes to a breakfast thing every so often, and there's like an agenda for what you're going to talk about at the table among this group of strangers. And it is clearly because this is a group of people that we assume won't be able to just riff with each other, can't just improvise a social experience. And I think, if anything, if a bar teaches you anything, it is how to talk to strangers. It is how to make small talk, fill time, play a little dice. Like you're learning something important there. I wonder if you think, you as, because you and I are aging journalists, we have worked with a lot of much younger people. I wonder, having observed those, kids of that generation and thinking as you have about the role of alcohol in society, where are we headed? How do you think about that?
Well, let me, as is my annoying habit, problematize some of the data for you.
Go.
I do think that one way of slicing the clearly true observation that younger people, so called Gen Z, let's say 18 through 30, whatever,
right,
are spending less money on alcohol, is, first of all, you want to cut off the 18 to 21-year-olds because they ain't supposed to be doing that. Right. Not just because of the legalities of it, but because their prefrontal cortex isn't developed yet, and they're not supposed to be consuming stuff that will mess that up. So
you really shouldn't be drinking until 25 anyway.
Don't do that. But there's some good numbers that say that that younger generation is actually spending about the same proportion of their income that any other generation did at that age. They just make less.
Oh, wow.
Because they're getting screwed by a whole bunch of different factors.
Right.
So that may be going on. But the loneliness thing is an interesting twist on those numbers too. I'm a little skeptical of the loneliness numbers, but I do see different socializing patterns even in my own kids who are late teens, early 20s. So anecdotally, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe. And that difference is they're socializing, but they're doing it often from their computer.
Yeah.
Alone, essentially. I mean, with people online, but not with people IRL.
Mm-hmm.
And the drinking patterns for younger people typically are and have been drinking socially. It's a social lubricant because you're a teenager, and so you're weird and you are awkward. Some of us remain this way. And so, you have alcohol because also it's kind of cool and it's transgressive and all that stuff. So if they're not in person, they're not engaging with it in an adult pattern of like, I'm going to have a glass of wine with dinner. That's not what it is. It's a party thing. And since they're not at those parties as much, nominally, I mean, this is another theory, because a lot of the hypotheses about this are around like wellness and they're like different patterns. And I don't know if I buy those as much as I do differences in the economics of it and some different social patterns, whether they're about loneliness or not, or whether they're just because people socialize electronically, especially because we're talking about a specific generation that spent years alone because of the pandemic, because of COVID.
Yeah, right. That's my, I mean, your kids also did this, but my kids also were in a very formative age when the pandemic hit. And I remember one of the teachers that we really respect at our school described sort of kids in general from that little group to be, they say, they believe that they are the main character of the story and they believe they're anonymous. So there's a fun, and she was like, and that makes it really hard to teach them. And I was like, yeah, I bet that's weird. I bet that's hard. But I do find myself like, I remember once upon a time back when I was a big drinker and considered myself pretty talented at making the party fun at a bar. I thought that I had this little like brilliant business model because I'd spent a fair amount of time with a certain kind of adventurous Japanese tourist for whatever reason. Many times in many parts of the world, I have been in places where like this very particular kind of, because you got to be really brave to leave Japan out into the world. You don't speak other languages particularly easily or well. You're used to an incredibly clean and organized society, and you're willing to go like bum around a place like Italy where who knows where the trains are going to show up. I just remember thinking the Japanese were so amazing for their appetite for adventure in that way. And I thought I would make somehow a living like curating extremely adventurous party experiences for Japanese tourists. And at that time I was like, we'll drink, we'll do other stuff, we'll bop around, I'll take them to weird warehouse parties, like, well, let's go. But I think I do find myself wanting to engineer a little bit of that for this generation that does spend so much time, as you say, looking at each other on screens, but not like in each other's presence. And I think there's something in this, like I want I don't want them to drink, but I want them to go to bars, And I don't know how we do that,
See, you another secret reason that I wrote a booze book is that I finally have something to make small talk about in a bar.
Yeah,
I'm so terrible at it. So now I'm either the world's most entertaining person to have a drink with or the world's most annoying person to have a drink with, depending on what your proclivities are.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, but I just, I feel like I want kids to have had that. I want them to have the narrative. I want 1 in 10 of them like you to have the narrative, sort of evangelical conversion kind of experience around socializing with each other through a historically powerful chemical legacy. You know what I mean? There's something human in that I think is sort of fading. And I say this as someone who no longer drinks and doesn't recommend it to anybody,
Yeah, I'm not sure I would recommend it to anybody. either.
Yeah.
Because it's probably, on balance, it might not be the healthiest way to spend your time, but it does become a way to spend time with other people. And that part of it has been kind of delightful. And I don't know what, something ought to replace that. And I don't think it's sports. And I think maybe it's games. I think that the relationships that we have that are mediated via digital technologies are real relationships. And I've found, Twitter and then Blue Sky to be very valuable emotionally, like just fun, not like for my career, but like, no, I just enjoy this. That's one of my great frailties as a professional attention economy person is I don't particularly enjoy those mediums. I'm terrible at Twitter. I'm terrible at Blue Sky. I'm not funny. I don't, funny. Well, but not in that format. You keep me to 140 characters and I can't be funny. This is why I host an hour-long plus podcast. It's ridiculous, right? Like I need to go on and on and on and on in order to kind of get into the stuff I want to get into. And this has always been my great difficulty with trying to learn other languages. I'm like passable in a handful of Romance languages, but like I'm not funny in any of them, which makes speaking those languages painful to me because I can't be in any way charming in those other languages. You know what I mean? So you're plenty charming in any language.
I'm tall. I'm tall. They like that, but otherwise, they just are like, okay, he's kind of a child. Let's point him at his bus. But I think that there's something like, I don't know quite what I'm getting at here. Other than that, I think that there is something that you have distilled from the subject of booze that speaks to us about obviously all the things you cover so well, the history of it, the chemistry of it, the sort of the conquest of chaos of it. But there's something about the connecting with one another that feels really crucial. And I hope it can at least be some sort of model for how people interact in future without obviously all of the baggage and violence and cirrhosis and the rest of it, But that's one of the things I got out of your book was there's this like, we can connect over these things. We can cherish history together and make ceremony and magic out of them without, it's a way of conquering the emptiness of space. There's something powerful about that for me.
If we can find the common ground there doesn't exist in the like, wow, I feel dizzy now and I didn't before. That's like the least interesting thing about booze. There are, you can find the commonalities of like, here's where that comes from. Here's why it's that way. Here are the systems that made it that way. Here are the things about us as people that make it interesting to us. And those are things that we share. It's very, I've written these two books and they're both essentially about sensory experiences. And part of the reason that they're like that is that we have these sensory experiences that happen just inside our own heads. We've got these we've got these sensors on the outside of us that let us perceive a world, and then we make that world in our brains, and nobody really knows how we do that. We make mind, but it's a really cool thing that we do, but it's a very lonely thing. And even though we all do it, and we communicate those things to each other through language. And so that I can tell you what my primary indexicality is of the universe, what my sensory experience of the universe is, and you can tell me what yours is, and if we have enough language, we can see where they overlap and how they sync, and if they don't. And that's really important to me and beautiful. And it's not just true for booze. It's not just true for colors. It's true about almost everything that I've written. It's true almost everything you've ever written about too. The shared experience of technology that we have now is such an alienating one, but also one that we're sharing with each other.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Trying to understand.
Adam Rogers, the books are Proof and Full Spectrum. We didn't even get into Full Spectrum, which does the same thing for color as he did for alcohol. They're really amazing books. I hope you check them out. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thanks, man. Good to see you.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.